Welcome to Into the Archive, where we delve into the darkest corners of true crime. In today's episode, we journey back to a time of profound change in South Africa, a nation grappling with its own identity. But while the world saw a country healing, a different kind of evil was festering in the shadows. This is the story of Stuart Wilken, a man who called himself the Boetie Boer, or Brother Farmer, a name that masked a monster responsible for acts of sadism, cannibalism, and necrophilia. Join us as we explore the making of a killer and the society that unknowingly hid him, the early 1990s. For South Africa, it was a decade of miracles and monsters, born from the same chaotic fire. As the world watched, Nelson Mandela walked free and the brutal system of apartheid began to crumble. A new era, the Rainbow Nation, was dawning, a time of impossible hope, reconciliation, and the promise of a brighter future. But in the coastal city of Port Elizabeth, a different kind of shadow was stretching across the landscape. While the nation's attention was fixed on political violence and seismic social change, something far more personal, far more intimate, and far more depraved was taking root. He didn't have a dramatic, headline-grabbing name at first. He was just a face in the crowd. He called himself the Boetie Boer, Brother Farmer, a simple, almost friendly nickname, the kind of name that belongs to a neighbor, a co-worker, someone you'd never look at twice. But behind this mask of ordinary Afrikaner familiarity lurked a predator unlike any other. He was a sadist, a cannibal, a necrophile, and a killer who would ultimately shatter the most sacred of family bonds. This is the story of Stuart Wilken, the Boetie Boer, and the anatomy of a monster who turned his own unspeakable childhood pain into a weapon, unleashing it on the innocent during a nation's most vulnerable hour. To understand how Stuart Wilken operated for nearly a decade without being caught, you have to understand the world he lived in. The South Africa of the early 1990s was a country holding its breath. The transition to democracy was not peaceful. Politically charged violence erupted in townships, claiming thousands of lives. The police, the government, the media, their resources and their focus were aimed squarely at this national crisis. It was the perfect storm for a serial killer. The social fabric was tearing, and in the chaos, the disappearance of a prostitute or a runaway child barely registered as a blip on the national radar. These were society's forgotten victims, and their absence created no outcry. Stuart Wilken understood this. He thrived in it. The nation's turmoil was his camouflage. He operated in Port Elizabeth, a city now known as Gqeberha, and his chosen disguise, the Boetie Boer, was a stroke of manipulative genius. It was a name that conveyed a simple, unthreatening blue-collar identity. It was designed to put people at ease, to lower their guard. And for his vulnerable targets, it worked time and time again. This ordinary man, this Brother Farmer, could get close to people, and once he was close, the mask would fall away. The first body was found, then another, and another. A pattern began to emerge, but it was a confusing one. The victims were different. Sometimes they were adult women who worked the streets. Other times they were young boys. For investigators, the lack of a consistent victim profile was baffling. But for the few experts beginning to work in South Africa's brand new field of forensic psychology, it was a terrifying sign, a sign of a deeply fractured and complex predator. One of those experts, profiler Mickey Pistorius, would later say of Wilken, quite simply, "He was one of the worst sadists I have ever met." The evil that Stuart Wilken unleashed upon the world was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in the fires of a childhood so horrific it's difficult to comprehend. His life story is a relentless chronicle of abandonment, betrayal, and abuse, a perfect recipe for creating a human predator. It began in November of 1966. At just 6 months old, Stuart and his 2-year-old sister were left in a public telephone booth in Boksburg. Abandoned. Their first experience of the world was being discarded like trash. They were found by a domestic worker who, in what seemed like an act of kindness, took them to her employer, a man known only as Dupe. But this was no rescue. For the next year and a half, the infant Stuart was subjected to extreme physical and sexual abuse at Dope's hands. During this period of unimaginable terror, his sister, the only familiar person in his young life, disappeared forever.
Around the age of 2, he was found by neighbours, the Wilkins. He was in poor health and clearly neglected. They took him in, gave him a new name, and moved the family to Port Elizabeth, offering him a fresh start. But the pattern was already set. The cycle of suffering was destined to repeat. Wilkin was a troubled child. He acted out at school and at home. By the age of 8, he began experimenting with drugs. Then, at age 9, another profound betrayal occurred. He was harmed by a trusted authority figure, first a caretaker, now a man of influence. The message burned into his young mind was clear. Trust can be broken, and those in power can cause great harm. In later confessions, Wilkin gave investigators insight into his motivations. He told them that as a child, while enduring pain, he had prayed to God for help, for deliverance. But his prayers were met with silence. He felt utterly abandoned by the highest power he knew. And that feeling of helplessness hardened into a deep, all-consuming rage, a rage against God. He decided that if God would not act, he would. If God had failed him, he would become God. He told profilers in a chillingly simple statement, "I wanted to be God." The only way to escape his powerlessness was to seize absolute power for himself, the power over life and death. This desire to play a higher power explains the strange duality of his victims. He targeted 2 distinct groups, adult female mine workers and young boys. Each group fulfilled a different, twisted psychological need. The young boys were a mirror. They were the small, helpless, vulnerable child he once was. In dominating and harming them, he was symbolically destroying the weakness he hated in himself. He was reenacting his own suffering, but this time, he was the one in control.
The women represented something else. Perhaps a rage against the mother who abandoned him, or simply a deep-seated hatred for figures he could easily control. Together, the 2 victim types were the physical embodiment of his life's traumas: abandonment, abuse, and the feeling of being utterly powerless. His method of harming was always intimate, always about control. He preferred strangulation. He claimed the act of choking the life out of them heightened his own sense of power. It was the ultimate expression of control, to literally hold a person's life in his hands and extinguish it. But he added another layer to his ritual, a signature act of psychological cruelty. As he was harming them, he would force his victims to call out, to shout to God for help. He made them plead to the very entity he believed had failed him. And when their pleas went unanswered, when their voices fell silent, Wilkin solidified his role. In that moment, he wasn't just a perpetrator. He was the God who answered no prayers, the ultimate punishing authority. But the act itself was never enough. For Stuart Wilkin, the ending was just the beginning. The true horror of the Boetie Boer case lies in what he did afterward. Stuart Wilkin's confessions revealed a level of cruelty that shocked even the most hardened investigators. His signature acts went far beyond harming. He admitted to engaging in deeply disturbing acts after death, and he admitted to cannibalism. With at least one adult victim, he confessed to removing and consuming parts of her body at the crime scene. He described with a disturbing detachment how he had taken parts of her and that he would have preferred to have prepared them first. He described attempting to remove internal parts of her body. These were not the acts of someone seeking mere gratification. This was about total destruction, total consumption. To own, to harm, and to absorb another human being so completely that their physical form was desecrated. This is what Mickey Pistorius saw. This was not just murder. This was the work of an extreme sadist. And underneath this chaotic cruelty was a chillingly calculating mind. Wilkin frequently returned to his crime scenes, not just to relive his actions, but to study the police. He would watch them work, taking notes. He observed how quickly they responded, how they collected evidence, what they seemed to be looking for. He told investigators that this surveillance allowed him to do things more perfectly the next time. He saw the investigation as a game, a contest between him and the authorities who had failed to protect him as a child. Every day he remained free was a victory, fueling his God complex. He remarked to police that while some of them were good, they weren't good at catching me. For years he was right. He moved through the shadows, a ghost hiding in plain sight, his cruelty escalating. And eventually the boundary between his secret life as a perpetrator and his life as a family man would not just blur, it would completely disintegrate. For most killers there is a line. They compartmentalize. The monster hunts outside, but the family man comes home. For Stuart Wilkin, that line ceased to exist. His pathology was so pervasive, so all-consuming, that it eventually turned inward upon his own family. He took the life of his own adolescent daughter, Wayne. When asked to explain this incomprehensible act, Wilkin constructed a twisted, self-serving justification. He claimed that Wayne was being harmed by her stepfather. His motive, he said, was to send her soul to God, to save her. He was framing his own act as a form of salvation. It was a chilling psychological projection. He was casting his own childhood trauma onto his daughter, and then appointing himself as the final, merciful authority. By taking her life, he wasn't just a killer. He was a righteous decider of fate, reinforcing his delusion that he, and not God, was in control. His descent into domestic horror didn't stop there. Wilkin also took the life of Henry Bakers, the son of his second wife, his own stepson, and after that act he confessed to engaging in disturbing acts with Henry's remains. The killing of family members, especially children, represents the total collapse of a killer's internal world. The combination of killing his daughter under the guise of mercy and the profound violation of his stepson's body shows a psyche with no moral compass, no boundaries, and no humanity left. The monster he had become was no longer a secret. It was everything. The Boetie Boer's reign of terror finally came to an end in January 1997. He was arrested in connection with the disappearance of 2 children, and the carefully constructed walls of his double life came crashing down. Once in custody, he began to talk. Forensic psychologist Dr. Gerard Labouchaine spent approximately 40 hours in unstructured interviews with Wilkin, patiently listening as the full, horrifying scope of his crimes poured out. The confessions were detailed, unemotional, and complete. He admitted to everything: the killings, the dual victims, the disturbing acts, the cannibalism. The judicial process was swift. In February 1998, Stuart Wilkin was convicted of 7 counts of murder and 2 counts of sexual violation. He was given 7 life sentences. The presiding judge, Justice Chris Jansen, noted that if the death penalty had not been abolished in the new South Africa, Wilkin would have certainly faced it. His crimes were considered an abomination, even in a society that had become hardened by violence. The case was a landmark for forensic psychology in South Africa. It proved that understanding the why was just as important as knowing the what. The work of profilers like Pistorius and Labouchaine provided the crucial context, linking Wilkin's unimaginable childhood trauma to his adult rage. They painted a picture of a man so broken, so consumed by a need to reverse his own powerlessness that he declared war on God and made himself the arbiter of life and death on the streets of Port Elizabeth. The case of Stuart Wilkin forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. Is it born or is it made in the crucible of unimaginable trauma? And how many others like him are created when society itself is in turmoil? Thank you for listening to this episode of Into the Archives. If this story has affected you, please consider supporting organizations that work with abused children. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps others find these important stories. Join us next time as we uncover another shadow lurking in the dark.